ou fizemos uma reforma muito importante, e eu acho que foi um marco, porque estávamos à beira de um abismo fiscal. E nós, praticamente, conseguimos salvar a parte de despesas governamentais e despesas públicas, que tem sido um obstáculo permanente, persistente para o crescimento do Brasil. E quando nós atacamos pensão, despesas, remover privilégios, pagamentos de taxas de juro, porque nós mudamos o mix de política fiscal, depois. E as taxas de juros, ou seja, a parte de equilíbrio de preços também. E agora nós temos preços de equilíbrio mais baixos e também, depois de mudarmos o mix de política. E também, nos primeiros 2 anos, tivemos 200 bilhões de reais de empresas estatais que nós vendemos, reduzimos nossa coeficiente PIB, dívida PIB, reduzimos a déficit fiscal 2%, 1%. Então, na direção certa, quando em 2020 fomos atingidos pela pandemia. Nós tivemos, então, as medidas de emergência que foram colocadas, as expectativas iniciais eram tenebrosas, que poderia cair, por exemplo, 10% PIB, por causa de ameaça de uma depressão, e o tempo todo tive muita confiança que o Brasil teria uma recuperação, e justamente porque estamos trabalhando nos fundamentos. Nós quebramos os 3 primeiros pontos de gastos governamentais: pagamento de taxas de juros, o terceiro, os salários do setor público, e primeiro, o setor da previdência privada, a previdência, com 20% além da inflação nesses últimos anos, e de repente nós quebramos essa trajetória explosiva e nós congelamos salários por 2 anos no setor público, em 2020 e 2021, simplesmente quebramos esse caminho, interrompemos, e agora estamos colocando no Congresso uma reforma administrativa que vai economizar mais 300 bilhões de reais, e na faixa mais baixa, porque usamos um fator de substituição de 75%. Então, se pensar naqueles que vão se aposentar, pensamos de cada 100, 75 são contratados, e, na verdade, nós estamos contratando 25 e não 75, porque estamos maciçamente digitalizando o governo. Até os pagamentos de ajuda de emergência, se você for, por exemplo, no INSS, programas de assistência, todos esses programas foram digitalizados, e para cada 100 que vão embora, nós contratamos 25, 26. Então, os gastos poderiam ser mais do que 450 bilhões, provavelmente 500 bilhões, nos próximos 10 anos. Então, nós quebramos realmente este caminho, nós interrompemos esse caminho, os mercados reconhecem isso, subiu a bolsa, as taxas de juros de longo prazo começaram a descer de novo, depois de um período. Nós também observamos aquele overshooting, que foi para 5,80, 5,60, agora está indo mais em direção a 5, falando da taxa de câmbio, e não vai subir tanto novamente. Então, agora estamos entrando no nosso terceiro ano, e assim como surpreendemos o mundo quanto ao PIB, quando diziam que o Brasil poderia cair 10%, exatamente o contrário aconteceu. No Reino Unido caiu mais de 9%, França mais de 7%, Itália mais de 8%, Japão 4,5%, Alemanha 5% e Brasil 4,1% de queda. Mas mais do que isso, mais importante do que isso, do que o PIB cair menos do que esperado, nós geramos empregos no mercado formal de trabalho. Criamos 1 milhão de empregos nos últimos 4 meses desse último ano, 1 milhão mais durante os primeiros 4 meses deste ano, 2021. Então, o Brasil está criando empregos no mercado formal e sendo 1,2% no primeiro TRI, mais do que a China, mais do que a maior parte dos países da Europa. Então, o Brasil está surpreendendo com surpresas boas e temos certeza de que isso vai continuar. E a razão pela qual estamos otimistas a respeito do caminho da economia brasileira é porque estamos vendo as reformas passando, sendo aprovadas e sendo colocadas. Então, estamos renovando as camadas de proteção para a população brasileira, estamos finalmente deslanchando a vacinação em massa para a população adulta. Já vacinamos 50 milhões de pessoas. Então, 25, 26% já foram vacinadas com a primeira dose, 13, 14% da população com a segunda dose das vacinas, mas mais importante é que a taxa que nós estamos avançando nas vacinas e produzindo internamente vacinas também, a expectativa é que toda a população seja vacinada, a população adulta, até o final de setembro e a população total até o final do ano. Isso pode garantir uma volta segura ao trabalho. A economia está reagindo muito bem. Então, abril passado, quando fomos atacados pela primeira onda, perdemos 900 mil, quase 1 milhão de empregos no mercado formal. E esta vez criamos 100 mil. Nesse mesmo abril, em que fomos atingidos por essa segunda grande onda. A economia brasileira está se adaptando, desenvolvendo protocolos para garantir a volta ao trabalho com segurança, home office ainda continuando de uma maneira muito eficaz, e o Brasil não está agora sentindo esse grande impacto da segunda onda, ou não tão fortemente quanto sentiu na primeira. E mais do que isso, está
all cities and all sectors of the Brazilian economy. So it is a very widespread phenomenon, the resumption of growth in Brazil. It's all sectors, all regions, and all cities. So it's something that really it was a big surprise to most people, but we were very confident that at some point the fundamental reforms that we are advancing should have some effect. And in a few weeks, I think the most important thing that happened this year was the election for the president of the lower house and the president of the Senate. And for the first time, the government is now enjoying parliamentary support for our proposals. So it is true that we got parliamentary support in the first year for the Social Security reform, but we could not advance with privatizations, we could not advance with the regulatory marks, with the tax reform, because there was a lot of noise, and especially because in the second year we were hit by the pandemics. Now Brazil is working full speed ahead in the sense that we are not only extending the protection layers for the population on the health front, But we are also resuming the reforms, the structural reforms. And then I would just pinpoint a few ones that were pushed through the Congress in the last few weeks. An independent central bank, which was something we were pursuing for 40 years, 4 decades. A new fiscal framework with triggers that could freeze public spending as soon as at the municipal, state, and federal levels, as soon as expenditures reach a threshold as a fraction of revenues. So you could freeze for 1 year and a half, 2 years expenditures on wages, for instance, which means that no fiscal crisis would last more than a year and a half, because with a country growing 4%, 5%, inflation of 4%, nominal GDP growing and revenues growing 10%, if you just freeze expenditures for 1 year and a half, the fiscal crisis is diluted. So it was very important to approve the fiscal framework. It was very important to approve the independent central bank to prevent transitory sector price increases like food, like energy. We had an energy shock, a recent energy shock for lack of rains, climate change. So to prevent these sector transitory price increases, relative price changes into generalized price increases, we approved the independent central bank. So with the fiscal framework, independent central bank, the regulatory marks of natural gas and sanitation, water and sewage. As soon as we approved the natural gas regulatory mark, new framework, we succeeded in privatizing one of the most important companies in Brazil in the sanitation sector, SEDAI. It mobilized around $10 billion, $50 billion, $20 billion in the auction, and another $30 billion of commitment. And this is exactly how a consumption-based cyclical recovery is transforming itself into an investment-led sustainable recovery, because people are really committing themselves to 10 years, 15 years of future investment when they participate in an auction like that. And in a few weeks, we sold like 22 airports, 6 seaport terminals, 1 railroad, and there's still a lot of equities, 150 equities still to go, coming in the next year and a half. So we are very, very confident that Brazil is really resuming growth, that our fundamental reforms in regulatory marks will unleash these investment waves. We believe also that resuming our international agenda, we are reducing unilaterally import tariffs and also talking to our Mercosur friends, because we want to have some flexibility and modernization in the Mercosur, because staying closed was very damaging to Brazil in the last 30 years. Brazil is trading less with our Mercosur partners today than it traded as a fraction of GDP 20 years ago. So it was a trap. It was a trap. It prevented Brazil from engaging into productive, more efficient integration, industrial integration into global chains. So we are resuming our privatizations also. We just approved the Postal Service and Eletrobras. Eletrobras is the most important, the largest energy company in Latin America. And we are just enlisting it in the privatization program now. It went through the lower house, and we are also very optimistic that the Congress, the Senate, the higher house, will approve it this week or next week. The plan is probably next week. We think this will be also a very important sign that Brazil is in the right track. And so I would say that the perspectives for the Brazilian economy now are really very, very interesting, very favorable. We think that the administrative reform and the tax reform will also go through the Congress in the next 3 to 4 months. It is going to be a simplified tax reform. It's also a very feasible, doable administrative reform. We think the Congress will approve both reforms. And so we believe that, again, the democracy will surprise the critics. We know that the future is green. We know that the future is digital. So whatever misunderstandings we might have, Brazil has the cleanest energy matrix in the world. It is true that we had problems with illegal deforestation, illegal land occupation. We are much aware of that. We are, in the last 2-3 months, we got in closer contact with Mr. Kerry, which is the man in charge by President Biden to talk about environment with Brazil. At the same time, we are still fulfilling all the measures we need to fulfill to guarantee our access to OECD. So we continue to dedicate to integrate the Brazilian economy to the global economy. So I think that we are in a much more comfortable situation today than 1 year ago or 2 years ago when we began. I very often use the image that Brazil was like a big whale harpooned successively by high taxes, by excessive public spending, by bursts of hyperinflation, by the closeness of our economy when the whole world was integrating itself. We that launched the first integrative platform, which was Mercosul 30 years ago, quite before ALCA, quite before the European Union, the European economic integration. Brazil launched this 30 years ago, and then 30 years later, Brazil was even closer than at the beginning. So we really changed that. We are fighting hard to change that model and doing all the reverse. If we have been increasing taxes for the last 40 years, we'll be simplifying and reducing taxes. If we had uncontrollable public expenditures going higher, now it's the other way around. We are using the ceiling, the cap, the spending cap, as a flagship, as something to be fought for, in the sense of controlling the public expenditures growth and allowing the Brazilian growth to switch gears and switch the axis. Instead of public sector investment, we now have the crowding in of private sector investments all over. So it's gas, natural gas, oil, sanitation, electric sector, cabotage, railroads. All these regulatory frameworks are going through, some of them already approved, some of them to be approved in the coming months at the Congress. So let's go now for the questions.
Thank you, Minister. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us again. We have several questions here. I will start with first about social programs in Brazil. The question is, there is a clear demand for a larger social program in Brazil. What do you intend to propose in order to meet this demand without jeopardizing the spending cap?
Good question. Well, one of the things that was quite clear during these pandemics is it became quite transparent. It is an enormous social inequality. We knew that already. We knew that we had some social programs functioning. But when you have a situation like this, that dramatic, it was an enormous responsibility on our part, the government, to take care of those people. So we prefer, if we were to make some mistake, we would prefer to make the mistake on the other side. So immediately, as soon as the crisis began, we immediately postponed taxes, anticipated benefits for the old people, for the most vulnerable people, low-income people, like people who we anticipated the wages. Usually, we call it 13th wage. We anticipated that. We postponed taxes. We digitalized 64 million people, and we began making a very effective income transfer program. So Brazil was really very effective on that. Our program worked faster and more effective than most programs designed abroad. I am very, very let's say, I have to change the word carefully, but I'm very comfortable with the idea that some programs could be as good as ours, but I didn't see anyone better than ours. So I really want to say this because I have a great team, great guys. We work at 1 year in a row without Saturdays, without Sundays, without traveling. Everybody trapped here, just working day and night on all these programs. And some of them, our friends from Bradesco know because they helped us. We designed a lot of credit programs, some of them for the big companies, like, for instance, air companies. We designed convertible debentures. For electric sector or energy sector, we designed credit programs with guarantee of receivables. Automotive sector, we designed credit programs with guarantees from the headquarters abroad, and so on. And then we went to the lower, it is a very distinctive characteristic of our credit programs that for the first time in Brazilian history, 48% of credit expansion was for small and average companies. It never happened before. All previous crises, the big guys get the loans and the poor guys get out of the party. So this time, 48% of credit expansion reached small and average companies. Same thing happened on the social front, in the health front, because we lowered the taxes, the import tariffs of 1,500 medical and health products, drugs. At the same time, we stimulate the production of masks, of pulmonary ventilators, of lung ventilators. At the same time, we put the Internal Revenue Service blockading any exports of those critical health products and services that we needed here. And we designed a very successful job preservation program, which was we call it the emergency benefit, which was we paid part of the wages of the companies so that they could preserve jobs. So instead of firing the employees, they preserved the job and the government paid part of the wages. So this was a very successful. We digitalized 11 million people who took advantage of this program. Well, Brazil has 46 million people in the formal labor market, being 13 million public employees with stability of employment and good wages. So the other 30 million, 33 million in the private sector formal market, one third of it would be fired. So 11 million people would be fired, and then the company phoned us, called us. We immediately sent the program, and they qualified, and we preserved 11 million jobs. So it was the first time in Brazil that you had a drop of GDP, amazing, fantastic, big one, really big one, 4%. Just to have an idea, the last recession of 3.5% dropped GDP just a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we destroyed 1.5 million jobs in 1 year. Well, this time we preserved 11 million and we created 140,000 new jobs. So it was really a very effective program. So I'm really congratulating our team because they were wonderful in facing this war against the pandemic. And also thanking the president for supporting the program, and also the other ministers that made a sacrifice to bring food to the cities. Teresa Cristina in agriculture, Tarcísio bringing, with the truck drivers, bringing the food to the big cities. So we kept the vital signs of the economy working. And then the economy bounced back in a V-shaped recovery. I was quite confident that it might happen. I never promised, but I was quite hopeful. And I always said, I think Brazil will be back in a V-shaped recovery. And so we are just renewing these programs. And then you ask, what about the new social program? Well, what we can guarantee is that we will follow very conservative lines with the usual programs. So if you talk about the most important program in Brazil, which is the Bolsa Família, we understand that it is an evolutionary family of social programs. So we'll follow the same lines. So we will increase the number of people who will qualify, like we did during the pandemics. We immediately shortened the queue. So there were like 1.5 million people applying. We immediately put everything inside, everyone inside. We covered everybody, and then we put a filter, and then we began removing the ones that did not qualify. But we prefer to putting everybody, to make the mistake if it happens on the good side, which is, well, let's protect everyone, and then we remove. So we had 68 million people in the first move. Now we are covering 44 million people. So focusing the program more and more. And we'll be renewing the Bolsa Família in the next 2-3 months. And always remember, one thing, we have two budgets. One budget is the pandemics, which is transitory, temporary expenditures. We spent 8.5% of GDP of primary deficit last year with the pandemic. Well, that kind of expenditures entirely collapsed to less than 3% already this year, because they were temporary expenditures. They were not permanent expenditures. So the permanent deficit, the structural expenditures, all the time, we kept in mind that we should have this double commitment, which is, okay, there will be all the money we can need for health problems. But no expenditure is permanent. It's just transitory. So if it is pandemics, there will be the money will be there, 8.5% of GDP, but it is transitory, it's strictly transitory. So the auxiliary emergency grant will be phased out probably in 2 or 3 months. So we'll be probably renewing them now for the next 2 months, because there is a clear notion in Brazil now that the pandemic should be controlled in 60 to 90 days, in the sense that by the end of September, this is what the governors, governor of São Paulo, governor of Rio de Janeiro, governor of Rio Grande do Sul, all governors are saying that the adult population will be shot by the end of September. So by the end of September, we should be probably with the pandemics under control. If it is not, we extend again. But we have to be renewing this. Who drives the extension of the auxiliary emergency grant? Answer, the pandemics. It is not political. It is technical. It is a health problem. So we created this last year. We renewed it this year to the end of July, 31 of July. And all estimates is that most of the Brazilian adult population will be already vaccinated by the end of September. So we are extending through August and September. If it is necessary, October, we go one more, no problem. But by now, we are extending by 2 months, 2 or 3. We are still, the president is deciding with the citizenship minister. It is not strictly an economic matter. I just have to finance it. The vote and the decision is on the citizenship ministry and the president himself. So probably 2 or 3 months more, and then the auxiliary grant is over. And then we should land on the social program. The social program should be a very by-the-book program. It is a conservative program. It is an evolutionary program. It certainly will have more people inside and more money. But everything still strictly inside the budget, respecting the spending cap. That's the social program, the usual social program. We are also studying a different program, which is, I call it the Fundo Brasil, the Brazil Fund, because one of the reasons we put the ceiling was to reduce the intervention of the government in the economy. In the last 4 decades, public spending was increasing so abusively that we went to hyperinflation, we went to high taxes, to interest rates very high, snowball indebtedness, all these symptoms of lack of control over public spending. So we received quite well the spending cap as something to control this uncontrollable bias that we had in the economy, and that caused generalized corruption in the political system, economic stagnation, a lot of misfunctionings like hyperinflation. So the idea of having a ceiling on public spending was very welcomed by us. But the ceiling, remember, is to reduce the size of the government. But what if I make a fund with all state companies and I began selling state companies, and part of this money is sent to the poorest guys in Brazil? So I would be spending money to reduce the size of the government because I'm selling state companies. So if I sell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big companies, and I give back to the Brazilian poor people the state companies that they owned, because all the opposition says is, well, you are selling the Brazilian network, the Brazilian wealth, private. You are trying to privatize the Brazilian wealth. We are answering the other way around. Say, no, we are not stealing the Brazilian companies anymore. We are now giving them to the Brazilian people. So this fund to eradicate poverty was created almost 30 years ago. And the idea was exactly, if you keep the state company with the government, at least give part of the dividends to the poor people. And if you sell these companies, at least give the capital gain and the proceeds of the sales to the poor people. So if we have to spend money, a little bit more of money, giving to the poor people, these state companies, I don't see a big problem in trying to operate or to make this fund operate. So it is what we are studying now. It's a distribution of wealth fund, not only an income transfer, which is the Bolsa Familia, where you distribute income, you make income transfers. But what about distributing wealth? What about giving exactly in the lines of Thatcher, exactly like she did, or like the Chileans did in Chile years ago, which is, well, if this belongs to the people, let's have popular capitalism. Let's sell these companies and give the money to the people because it belongs to them. So let's give the Brazilian people, poor people, properties. The state has 1 trillion reais in real estate. So I want to give this land to some people, to some poor people, at least part of this land. Of course, this is part of the Brazilian wealth. This is the counterpart of the debt. So we are very much aware of the situation, of the balance sheet of the union. So we are not going to throw all this money into a helicopter money. But what about giving part of this money to poor people? If poverty is so deep in Brazil, why not distribute part of our wealth to the poorest people? So this fund already exists. It is there. It is constitutional. And we are studying it to see how we can distribute wealth. It looks like a group of private entrepreneurs was also thinking of that. It's a movement called Convergence, something like that. It was, to my surprise, 10, 15 major Brazilian industrialists were talking about to create a fund to transfer property. And then I say, hey, guys, we are studying that. So let's talk about it. And we are talking to these guys. So, but this is not ready. This is under our studies. And it is not the by the book thing. The by the book is there. Is a social program, very well measured, very conservative, and under the spending cap, and very well behaved. So don't spend even a night concerned about us getting wild on the fiscal side just because there is election next year. We will never do it. The only way we could get wild if it is to privatize faster and faster.
That's really good to know, Minister. Thank you very much. I have 2 very quick follow-up questions on the subjects you raised, and then I'll move to the audience questions. So the 2 follow-up quick questions are, where will the money come from to extend the auxiliary, the emergency aid for another 2 or 3 months? Will it come from the money already budgeted for Bolsa Familia that has not been used fully, or will it be an extraordinary credit, for example? And the second one, the idea of creating a fund to finance future expenditure, well, it's under analysis too. It sounds really great, but how can you reconcile that with the spending cap? Will it be within the spending cap rules, or do you think this type of framework would get out of the budget? How do you see these 2 follow-up questions, please?
Okay, first question. It's 9 billion a month, the auxiliary grant. So 2 months would be 18 billion. But 7 billion are already there from the last auxiliary grant. 7 billion are already there. So we would need 11 billion. 11 billion extraordinary credit. So it's like the vaccines that we gave 20 billion last year. Now we had this 44 billion of the auxiliary grants. So it would be another tranche of extraordinary credit. I think that if you measure against what we achieved this year, remember that we began the year with a forecast for our our budget, our deficit of 287, 290 billion, 290 billion. So we know that these expenditures with the pandemics, they are off the budget. They are extraordinary credits. But notwithstanding that, we still get very much concerned about the size of the deficit. So the 287, 290 billion, it's all inclusive. It's everything inside. So because tax revenues came 100 billion above the forecast, our deficit dropped to 187 billion. So if we put another 12, 13 billion there with this new auxiliary grant, it is, I wouldn't expect any noise from the market, because I think it's a very reasonable thing. If you are having another 100 billion in tax revenues, unexpected, and then you spend 11 billion, 12 billion more with the pandemics. But even being with the pandemics, we are concerned with the size of the deficit. And we know that instead of having, let's say, we began the year thinking that all included, all in, it would be 3.5. And then it collapses to 2.7. And then if it goes to 2.9, no problem. Second question is about how to treat the, I call it the wealth distribution fund.
Sure.
How to treat that? Well, we are going through the Constitution itself and see if it, what it applies. Of course, the spending cap came much later. It is a very reasonable rule to follow to recurring expenditures, but what if they are residual? For instance, if I did not sell any company, the distribution end of the year is 0. So it is not recurrent, permanent expenditures at all. If I sell, I distribute. If I don't sell, I do not distribute. Or if I close the dependent, because, you know, we are making, let's say, 27, 30 billion. We receive dividends of good state companies of around 30 billion. But we spend those 30 billion in the dependent state companies, like we call, the ones that give losses, that produce losses every year. So we want to give a sign to society, which is, listen, guys, we carry these assets at a very high cost, which is the cost of the snowball indebtedness. So we are diffusing this snowball indebtedness program. So you saw that everybody was forecasting 100% of debt over GDP, and then we ended the year. We closed the year with 89%, and now all forecast is 85, 80, 83.5. So people are getting optimistic about our balance sheet repair, and we will accelerate the privatizations. So, but we want to put an incentive on this scheme, which is what is the incentive that the politicians have to privatize, to speed up privatizations, if it's just killing that? We economists understand that this is very valuable. We are protecting the future generations. We are freeing cash. When we reduce the debt GDP ratio, we are freeing cash that would otherwise go to interest payments. We know that there is more money for education, for health, for other things. But for the political world, because they have 4-year horizons, which is they have to be elected every 4 years, sometimes they think, well, why to reduce that? Just to stabilize that, but don't reduce it. But if I say, listen, if we reduce that, we can give the money back to the poor people. So I give them an incentive to stimulate the privatization programs. So why are we privatizing companies? First, because we want to get rid of the losses that they produce. They destroy $20 billion a year, 20 billion reais a year. So they destroy. We were making some calculations here. We destroy one Petrobras every 7 years. We destroy the value of Petrobras, one Petrobras every 7 years, with the losses of the dependent state companies. So if you say, I'm protecting the future generations and selling some companies, this is too abstract for politics. Politics needs also some short-term results. And we are not ashamed of our program. Our program is to privatize. When they ask me, would you sell state companies? I say, all of them. I want to sell all of them. And they mistakenly say, the minister said he promised to sell all of them. And then when they ask me, what about the deficit? I say, I want to zero it. And then they say, he promised to zero. I never promised. I always say, I want to. I want to zero the budget. I want to sell all state companies. This is not a promise. This is a desire. But then we have to stimulate the political world to come with us, which is what we stand for. We stand for a market economy and the reduction of poverty. So if I'm selling state companies in direction of a market economy to reduce poverty, which is the object of this fund, so we have to think about it.
Minister, your staff said we just have 8 minutes left, so I'll be very quick. There are dozens of questions here, sorry. But I'd like to tackle on the tax reform. Yesterday, we had the chance to talk with Arthur Lira, the president of the lower house here at this forum, and he said that it seems that the Congress is ready to vote a tax reform, although in pieces. It's the possible reform, as you guys have been saying for a while. So how do you see the next steps of the tax reform? And specifically, what about the income taxes on dividends and funds, and not only that, but the CBS, the Brazilian CBS, and also other types of tax? How do you see this evolving, and if there is room to send these pieces to Congress? The President Lira said yesterday that it would be nice if he could have the whole project, despite slicing it in pieces to try to approve. How do you see the room for the tax reform this year?
Well, we are working very much well together. From the very beginning, the President of the Senate and the President of the lower house have been very constructive. The first conversations we had were exactly about the auxiliary grants and vaccines. So we immediately converged on that and focused on that in a few weeks, and then we produced results on both fronts. Immediately later, we began talking about how to proceed with the reforms, administrative and tax reform. And we also agree with the President Lira, President of the lower house, and the President of the Senate, that we would send tax on consumption and income to the lower house. And all regularization, normalization, refinancing, all the I call it the tax passport. We are flying from the old regime to a new tax regime. So we want to offer a passport. If you want to fix your situation with the Internal Revenue Services, if you want to revalue your assets, if you want to refresh your sources, if you want to, if you were hit by the pandemics and you lost, like, let's say 40, 50% on your revenue, if you're a small business, you have a restaurant, you were hit by the pandemics, and then you collapsed entirely your sales. They collapsed 80%, 90%. It's just not reasonable. We helped people, we helped to preserve jobs, we gave credit, but what about the companies that just collapsed, entirely collapsed? It's not reasonable to go there and chase the guy. So we must offer him a passport to this new world. And if his revenues, his received revenues collapsed 80%, 90%, well, we can give him a discount on taxes of 70%, 80%, and just begin your new life. It's a small guy. He's fighting hard to survive. He's trying to create new jobs. So let's you coming from the banks, you know what is to get into negative files, have negative files with the banks. It's pretty hard. So we want to clear up the lives of these guys. So this thing is going to the Senate, and tax on consumption and income tax are going to the lower house. We are already working together. So we are designing Senator Fernando Bezerra, which is the senator. He's the special envoy of the President Pacheco, the president of the Senate. We also have Senator Hildo Rocha, which is the relator of the Commission on Taxes. So we are working closely to these guys, and at the same time working with the lower house also very closely with Lira and his leaders. And it is a very simple thing. Our rule of thumb was remove whatever is very controversial, and let's approve what is reasonable and widespreadly accepted. So the value-added tax is something that we hold during our presidential campaign. All the time we said it's going to be a dual value-added tax. Dual because we recognize our right infra-constitutionally. We don't need the Constitution to fix our value-added tax for the revenue service, for the federal revenue service. We don't need a constitutional amendment or anything of the kind. So we just said, let us do our part, our job. And if the governors want to join us later, okay, we can send a constitutional amendment to Senate, offering the conditions to put them together, to transform the CBS, which is a contribution based on value added, on a tax, which is the fusion, would be the fusion of the federal and state taxes. So we are going to offer the blueprint for this fusion. But first, we want to prove what is our right, which is just to change our value-added tax, because it's simple. It's already there. It is already there. It's very simple to approve. And if we want to have one value-added tax, better have at least half of it, which is us, the federal level. So this is uncontroversial. If you want to have one big tax together, begin with the federal, and then you join the states. It is going to be pretty much harder to bring the municipalities because they thrive on tax on services, which is ISS. So they are not willing to change that dramatically. And it is very serious if you just try an experiment with them and then they lose their tax basis suddenly. And then you have a problem in security, you have a problem in health, education, all the responsibilities at municipal level. So we prefer to have an agreement with the state level first, merge our taxes first, and then over time we go and get also the municipalities. The first chapter then is this. The second chapter, which is also not much controversial, is to reduce the IPIs, the tax on. It is no accident that our agriculture is flying. There is no IPA, which is tax on agricultural product. So the private initiative is thriving on the rural sector, on the agricultural sector. But if you have a tax on industrial products, you really want to deindustrialize your country because you are taxing everything which is industry, which is not reasonable, not reasonable. But since it's very controversial now, because I would certainly use the transaction taxes to reduce all taxes, tax on labor, tax on industrial products, tax on value added. All of them could be reduced if you had a different tax basis on transactions. But you know, we are in a democracy, so I was defeated. So no hurry. Next time we try again, and some other time we try again. So let's simplify it. We reduce and simplify the IPIs also, going for homogeneous taxation instead, and having only what the Americans call the sin taxes, which is drugs, alcohol, tobacco. So you just let these that have negative externalities with higher taxes, and all other IPIs you reduce. This is the second chapter. Third chapter, income tax, also without many controversial things. Well, everybody understands that we should tax dividends and reduce tax on companies. So if the company withholds the funds to innovate, to create jobs, to invest, well, let's reduce taxes. Corporate tax all over the world, 40 years ago, 4 decades ago, they were around 40%. Recently, they were around 21%. Now the US is saying that they're going to increase taxes to 28, 29%. Well, we are on the other side. We can reduce taxes 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, before having the risk of having low taxes. We can reduce a lot before having the risk of having too low taxes on companies. So we have a commitment to reduce corporate taxes. We'll reduce 2.5 in the first year and 2.5 in the second year. Should we be re-elected, 2.5 again, and then 2.5 again, we'll keep trying. All the increase in revenues that we have, we will transform and translate in lower tax rates, because we think taxes are too high in Brazil. And one of the fundamental reasons why Brazil does not grow in the last 20, 30 years is exactly because we decided to finance excessive public spending, raising taxes all the time, or in our snowball indebtedness trap. So we will reduce corporate tax. We will increase, or we will begin taxing dividends. We'll keep the simplified schemes like Simples. All these things will be spared because it is working for these little guys. We'll be reducing subsidies in general. The program will not be now specified now, but we have a commitment from now to September. It is in our constitutional amendment of the fiscal framework to show how we're going to reduce the subsidies. So this thing is going sideways, but we are reducing subsidies for financial products. So today, you know that by the end of the month, all private bankers make a call to people who have money and ask, do you want to renew your LCA, your LCI? Do you want to, and under a good disguise, which is help infrastructure, help agriculture, what we are doing is tax exempting wealthy guys in what everybody else pays taxes. So to reduce these subsidies on financial products, I think is reasonable. And then some people, bankers, might think, well, this is going to raise interest rates for those sectors. False, because we can reduce, for instance, compulsory requirements and things like that to compensate. Brazil has too high compulsory requirements. They create a spread, which is undesirable. And then we keep offering subsidies to lower the rate for certain privileged or specific sectors. This is not reasonable. So all sectors should have the same supply price of capital, and the banks will charge less if we reduce, for instance, the compulsory requirements. So we are very much aware that we should not be subsidized, because everyone has a noble sector to subsidize. Infrastructure is very important. mobility, urban mobility is very important. Water resources are very important. Sanitation is very important. Agriculture is very important. So every one of these guys creates one specific investment vehicle, and then we subsidize them. Same thing with respect to if only wealthy guys can have, let's say, 5-year to buy a 5-year product from a bank, because he does not need the money for 5 years. Lower income people withdraw every time to pay school of kids, to pay doctors and things like that. So the government subsidizes long-term deposits for the banking sector. So why should we subsidize? Why should we charge more or less depending on the time that your product stands for? So if you want to convince someone to let the money with you 5 years, offer him a higher rate, and not me, not the government subsidizing you. So I feel like I'm subsidizing the bank, not the bank, but the wealthy guy, so that he keeps the bank, he keeps for 5 years the money with the bank. Oh, that's his problem and the bank's problem. It's not our problem. So we are removing these small subsidies here and there that the wealthy people don't need, and the banks could be compensated with reduction in compulsory requirements and technical things that would reduce the spread. So the thing is let's do clean reforms, easy things, everyone understands, no surprises. And then we go finally to the final chapter, which is the passport, the tax passport, which is basically, in the Senate, there are 2 or 3 proposals of refis, and we think that to keep refinancing the same debt once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, they keep doing this for years and years and years. So it doesn't solve the problem. So, okay, we can offer the last one, but with a menu of better choices. For instance, if you want to have a 30% discount, just pay it and disappear instead of keep rolling. You pretend you pay and I pretend I'm receiving. And we keep rolling over this thing. 60% of the contingent debt is held by 1% of the companies. So it's some big guys with some big lawyers, and they keep postponing the payment and postponing the payment. Well, let's solve this situation once and for all. So it is a very no-nonsense reform, very simplified. I don't think there will be big emotions about it, and I think it will be approved very fast.
That's crystal clear, Minister. Thank you very much. So I'll hand it over to André for his closing remarks, and thank you again.
Minister, I will highlight briefly your main messages, apologizing up front for simplifying this very interesting conversation. You started as saying that investors should be prepared for Brazil to surprise again on the upside. First, saying that GDP growth could reach 5% this year. Expectations were close to 3% a few weeks ago. Second, we may reach mass vaccination by September this year, with all the adult population vaccinated here in Brazil. And third, you highlighted reforms and privatizations. On reforms, you said you seemed optimistic about the Electrobras bill getting approved perhaps next week. Second, the administrative reform perhaps saving up to 500 billion reais over 10 years and making the state much more efficient, which is super important for Brazil. In terms of the tax reform, you highlighted several different initiatives here. For example, the federal VAT, which is probably the first step, then changes in the IPI, the sin taxes, reducing the rest tax rate for the rest of the products. Then you went to the income tax, saying that you'd like to tax dividends and at the same time cut taxes on corporate sector, and you'd like to reduce subsidies starting with financial products financial product designed to favor some specific sectors. It's better to favor all sectors at the same time instead of choosing some sectors. Then you talked about measures to help companies that got out of the pandemic with due taxes. So we're going to cut taxes for these small guys, help them recover from now on. And then we went to the social programs. On the social programs, you highlighted 3 different initiatives. One temporary initiative, which is perhaps to extend the emergency aid for additional 2-3 months, spend additional 11-12 billion reais, no more than that. It's a small amount of money, temporary amount of money due to the pandemic. We should not freak out because of that. Second initiative is a larger social program, but you highlighted that it will be within the cap. We should not be concerned about the fiscal accounts as we go to elections, because the economics team is very, very committed to a fiscal adjustment. And third, you called the wealth distribution fund, where you're going to put the state-owned enterprises, try to sell them and give the money to the poor guys. If they belong to the state, they belong to the poor guys. That's the way to distribute it. I'll pass over to you. Thank you for joining us here, and for you to close our meeting.
Well, I thank you very much, friends. I thank you for the help to make this economy more resilient. You've been all the time giving support to our programs. The only thing we have in the past that we did not understand each other was the transaction tax, and you won for the moment.
But the whole economic agenda.
I hope at least you see at least you saw the other side of it, which is, imagine a world where the labor cost is cut by half. You would never have 38 million people down the streets without jobs. So it is a cruelty. I call it an arm of mass destruction of jobs, which is all these taxes on labor, on the labor force. And I was always looking for some other tax that could substitute for this. But anyway, I thank you very much, the support. Your key role in explaining for foreign investors, and André Carvalho, Fernando Honorato with sharp questions, and André Carvalho with such a compact resume, a compact
summary. Yes, a nice summary.
Jesus Christ. Next meeting, I'll take André Carvalho, and then he speaks for me, because he delivers the whole thing in 10 minutes. It doesn't take 1 hour like me. So thank you very much.
So, Minister, on
take care of your health, and Brazil will go through this very soon.
And on behalf of Bradesco, we certainly support this economic agenda, very, very meaningful for changes the life of people, as you mentioned, those unemployed. So thank you very much for your resilience too. That's very important to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Minister.
Bye-bye.